My son and daughter-in-law moved into my quiet, seaside home and slowly took over everything: my kitchen, my routines, even my peace. At 65, after losing my husband, I realized they didn't see me as a mother anymore, but as a convenience. So I stopped arguing, stopped helping, and let one brutal midnight storm teach them the lesson I no longer had the strength to explain. The salty tang of the Atlantic sea mist crept through the weathered wooden siding of the coastal Maine cottage Evelyn had called home for over 30 years. At 65, following the passing of her husband, her greatest joy had dwindled to simple, quiet mornings. She loved sitting on the porch overlooking the bay, wrapping her hands around a warm mug of Earl Grey, and listening to the rhythmic crash of the waves against the jagged rocks. But over the last 3 months, that hard-earned serenity had completely vanished. Her eldest son, Vance, and his wife, Nora, had packed up their lives in Boston. They decided to relocate their freelance graphic design and Airbnb management business to the coast, claiming they needed to reconnect with their creative roots. They brought with them an energy that was vibrant but entirely consuming. Evelyn's living room, once a peaceful sanctuary where she mended old quilts and read historical biographies, was now overrun. Mood boards were pinned to the walls, fabric swatches littered the floor, and the relentless clacking of mechanical keyboards echoed late into the night. "Hey, Mom, we have a group checking in late to the rental property across town tonight," Vance called out from his makeshift workstation, his eyes glued to dual monitors as a midnight deadline loomed. "Can you run over around 9 to unlock the door and make sure the thermostat is set?" He spoke with an easy, unthinking assumption, the kind that presumed an older woman with an open schedule was naturally available to run errands for busy young professionals. Evelyn looked down at her freshly steeped tea, still untouched. She didn't snap, nor did she argue. Instead, she quietly studied the deep, dark circles under her son's eyes. In this modern world, busyness had become a religion, and the young expected everyone to worship at its altar. Evelyn stood up, pulled on her thick wool cardigan, and stepped out into the brisk, coastal chill. She went not because she wanted to be a cog in their machine, but because she realized something vital: if she didn't start drawing lines in the sand, her maternal devotion would soon be classified as just another free corporate asset. The invasion didn't announce itself with grand demands. It nibbled away at Evelyn's life through the subtle, insidious creeping of modern technology. Nora, who prided herself on being a lifestyle curator, took it upon herself to swap out the home's traditional lighting for smart bulbs controlled entirely by a smartphone app. Next came the recessed ceiling speakers installed to stream lo-fi jazz throughout the day, to optimize workflow focus. On more than one occasion, Evelyn jolted awake at 2 a.m. to the low thumping bass vibrating through the ceiling planks from the living room below, where Vance was frantically cranking out a design deck for a client in Seattle. When she walked into the kitchen the following morning, she discovered that her glass jars of dried, hand-foraged coastal herbs, which she had meticulously harvested and dried herself, had been banished to a dark corner of the pantry. In their place sat giant tubs of organic plant protein and Nora's high-powered industrial blender. "Oh, good morning, Evelyn," Nora chimed over the deafening roar of the blender, completely drowning out the morning gulls outside the window. Those old jars were just dust magnets and made the countertops look so cluttered. "I tucked them away in the back cupboard for you." Evelyn stood in the doorway staring at her sidelined herbs. A bitter truth crystallized in her mind: her children didn't dislike her. They were simply trying to modernize her according to their own aesthetic standards. They wanted a convenient, picture-perfect mother in a trendy, curated house that could serve as a backdrop for their social media feeds. Evelyn's own autonomy was being suffocated by smart devices and a thoughtless brand of millennial gentrification. She knew that if she kept suffering in silence, she would soon become a ghost in the very home that bore her name on the deed. Rather than staging a dramatic family intervention or nagging them about the noise, Evelyn chose an entirely different strategy, an active, deliberate retreat. Her first move had nothing to do with locking doors or fighting over physical territory. She simply stopped responding to their casual, transactional requests. One crisp afternoon, Nora was struggling in the backyard, trying to steady a massive wooden backdrop for a product photo shoot in the whipping wind. "Evelyn, can you come out here and hold this side down for a second?" she shouted toward the house. Evelyn stood by the glass window, watching the scene unfold. She didn't move a muscle. Instead, she turned back to her dining table and continued carefully polishing her late husband's vintage brass telescope, a hobby she hadn't touched in years. When Nora finally came inside windblown and visibly annoyed at having to wrestle the equipment alone, Evelyn merely offered a gentle, serene smile. "Would you like a hot bowl of French onion soup, dear?" she asked softly. The unspoken refusal caught Nora completely off guard. She couldn't justify throwing a tantrum, but she could instantly feel a distinct, unyielding distance stretching between them. That evening, Evelyn bypassed the smart home system entirely. She walked out to the hallway and flipped the dedicated breaker switch for the second floor, plunging her bedroom into darkness. She struck a match and lit an old beeswax candle. The warm, honest glow immediately drove away the sterile, bluish LED glare Nora had installed. Sitting in the quiet, flickering light, Evelyn felt herself plug back into her own soul. She didn't need to wage a war to reclaim her kingdom. She just had to refuse to play by their rules. Her silence wasn't a sign of defeat. It was an invisible, impenetrable fortress. The kitchen table became the next battleground for independence. Nora adhered to a strict, hyper-clean diet, routinely preparing unseasoned grain bowls, raw seeds, and microgreens for dinner. Evelyn, however, possessed the palate of a woman raised on the rugged New England coast. She craved rich, hearty stews, baked cod, with cracked pepper and thick slices of rye bread slathered in salted butter. On Monday evening, when Nora set down 3 identical plates of quinoa and avocado salad, Evelyn didn't take her usual seat. Instead, she walked over to the far corner of the counter, where she had set up a portable double-burner camping stove she'd quietly purchased at the local hardware store the day before. She placed a small cast-iron skillet on the flame, dropped in a generous pat of butter, and laid down 2 fresh cod fillets bought straight off the docks that morning. Within minutes, the rich, savory sizzle and the sharp aroma of toasted pepper filled the room, completely overpowering the bland scent of the raw greens. "Mom, you're not eating with us?" Vance asked, looking up from his salad. He stared at the little makeshift cooking station with a mix of confusion and bruised pride. "Honey," Evelyn replied, flipping the fish with practiced ease. Her voice was as light as a summer breeze. "Your salads are wonderful for your health, but my body needs a completely different kind of fuel. From now on, I'll be cooking my own meals on my own schedule." She plated her fish on a piece of vintage blue and white china, carried it out to the small table on the windy porch, and enjoyed her dinner in solitary peace. Splitting the meals wasn't just about flavor. It was Evelyn's declaration that she was no longer an appendage to their lifestyle. She was nourishing herself on her own terms, leaving the young couple at the modern table with a vague, unsettling sense of a connection slipping through their fingers. Thank you for watching Quiet Revenge. While AI tools may assist parts of our workflow, every story is carefully selected, edited, and reviewed by our team. If you'd like to help us continue creating emotional family stories for this community, You can support the channel with the cost of a small coffee. Patreon https://www.patreon.com/quiet revenge family. Ko-fi https://ko-fi.com/the story family. PayPal https://www.paypal.com/paypalme/kanhuangmin. Your kindness truly helps more than you know. By the 5th month of their stay, Vance walked into the kitchen, radiating excitement, carrying his laptop to show Evelyn a complex 3D rendering. He pointed eagerly at the screen, unveiling a complete overhaul of the backyard. The wild rose bushes and blackberry brambles her husband had lovingly planted decades ago were completely missing. We're going to clear out all those old overgrown bushes and put down a sleek multi-level cedar deck, Vance explained enthusiastically, fully expecting her approval. We can install a hot tub right here and market it to high-end weekend renters. This upgrade alone could easily double our booking revenue, Mom. It's a win-win. Evelyn stared at the screen. The harsh, boxy, minimalist lines of the modern architecture looked like a concrete weight crushing her green memories. She took a slow, deep breath, then gently but firmly reached out and folded his laptop closed. It's a beautiful design, Vance. But the answer is no, Evelyn said. Her gaze locked onto her son's eyes, steady and heavy as an anchor resting on the ocean floor. But why? Vance's voice spiked the accumulated stress of his workload, making him snap. Those old bushes are half dead anyway, and we need to scale the business to keep up with the mortgage and expenses. This is my home, Vance, and that garden belongs to the memory of your father. Evelyn said, her tone calm but immovable. If you need a commercial space for your hospitality business, you are more than welcome to lease a property downtown. I will not allow my sanctuary to be converted into a corporate line item. Vance sat frozen. He had never heard his mother speak with such absolute, unshakable authority. The direct refusal was a freezing splash of reality to a young man who had grown up assuming that everything his parents owned was ultimately his to use. Following the garden dispute, a heavy, suffocating tension settled over the cottage. Vance and Nora expressed their displeasure through passive-aggressive sighs and avoiding eye contact at all costs. They resorted to a classic cold shoulder, operating under the assumption that freezing her out would eventually force Evelyn to compromise. But Evelyn didn't stay home to endure the emotional freeze. Instead of joining local senior clubs or taking up pottery classes, she began spending the better part of her days down at the town's old commercial harbor. She wasn't just killing time. She had started helping out Mr. Atwood, an old family friend who owned a dusty maritime supply shop and restored antique compasses. It was meticulous, quiet work. She spent hours surrounded by the comforting sense of machine oil, weathered pine, and aged parchment sea charts. Back at the cottage, Evelyn's absence began to expose gaping holes in her children's daily routine. Vance's vacation rental business hit a major snag when guests started complaining about a total lack of local support, the small, invisible things Evelyn used to handle without a word, like stocking firewood or writing down directions to hidden beaches. Meanwhile, Nora was growing exhausted, trying to manage client deadlines while cleaning up a messy kitchen at the end of every grueling day. Evelyn simply wasn't there to pick up after them anymore. Late one afternoon, as a nor'easter began to roll in, Vance had to drive down to the harbor to source heavy-duty marine cables to secure some outdoor equipment. When he stepped into Mr. Atwood's shop, he stopped dead in his tracks. There sat his mother, under a warm desk lamp, wearing leather work gloves, carefully polishing a 19th century brass binnacle. Her face was serene, focused, and completely detached from the frantic, hyper-connected world he was drowning in. That night, the storm hit the coast with full force, sending howling winds ripping across the bluffs. The ocean roared against the rocks below, and around midnight, a massive old pine at the edge of the property came crashing down, crushing a section of the detached shed Vance used as his main studio. Suddenly, the entire town's grid went pitch black. The cottage was plunged into a dense, freezing darkness as the coastal chill began to seep through the window frames. Panic instantly set in for Vance and Nora. Their laptops were dead. Their phones were low on battery, the smart lights were completely useless, and their fancy electric kettle couldn't heat water. They stood huddled in the living room, illuminating each other's anxious faces, with weak smartphone flashlights looking utterly helpless against the raw power of nature. Then a soft glow appeared at the top of the stairs. Evelyn descended into the living room, carrying a vintage glass hurricane lantern filled with kerosene. The flame cast a wide, unwavering circle of amber light. She wasn't in her pajamas. She was still dressed in her thick wool layers. She set the lantern down on the coffee table, walked over to the kitchen, and pulled a large, heavy-duty thermos from the bottom cabinet, one she had smartly filled with boiling water right before the storm hit. "Drink some tea. It'll stop the shivering," Evelyn said quietly, placing 2 ceramic mugs in front of them. Her voice was as calm as if the storm outside were nothing more than a passing whisper. Nora wrapped her trembling hands around the warm mug. Staring at the steady flame of Evelyn's lantern, she realized that all their modern tools, apps, and sophisticated lifestyle choices had crumbled in a single stormy night. The widowed mother they had subconsciously written off as outdated was the only one who possessed the practical wisdom to survive. Sitting around the lone kerosene lantern, the roaring wind outside seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a heavy, fragile silence between the three of them. Vance watched his mother's weathered hands adjust the lantern's wick, and a deep wave of guilt and shame washed over him. "Mom," Vance finally spoke up, his voice raspy from the cold. "I'm sorry. About the garden, and honestly, about everything else. We've been incredibly selfish. I kept telling myself that bringing our business here, keeping the house busy, was helping you. I thought it would keep you from being lonely after Dad passed." Evelyn looked at her son. The reflection of the flame danced in her eyes, holding a lifetime of quiet wisdom. She shook her head gently. "Vance, you don't cure my loneliness by turning my sanctuary into your corporate office," she said softly. "I know the two of you are under immense pressure to succeed out there in the world. You want to build something of your own. But you forgot that I also need a space to grow old in peace." Nora lowered her head, a tear escaping and splashing into her tea. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn. I took over your kitchen, I changed your home, and I acted like my preferences were the only ones that mattered. I just assumed you didn't care about those details." "Of course I care, Nora," Evelyn replied tenderly. "But I chose to stay quiet so you could see it for yourselves. A mother's love doesn't mean allowing her children to erase her existence. I want nothing more than for you both to succeed. But you need to build your lives on your own 2 feet, not by leaning entirely on my shoulders." Once the storm cleared, a profound shift took place within the wooden walls of the cottage. There were no grand, dramatic promises, but practical actions quickly replaced the old, thoughtless habits. Vance and Nora packed up their mood board samples and electronics from the living room, officially leasing a small, dedicated office space down by the harbor. The smart bulbs were unscrewed and packed into boxes, replaced by the traditional switches and soft, warm, incandescent light Evelyn loved. Nora stopped managing the kitchen. Every morning she waited until Evelyn was completely finished cooking her breakfast before stepping in to prep her own meals. Respect was rebuilt through clear lines of time and space. On a bright Saturday morning, a few weeks later, Vance walked onto the porch and slipped a brass key onto the table. "Mom, we signed a lease on a small loft apartment near the marina. We're moving our things out by the 1st of the month. This house deserves its quiet back." Evelyn picked up the key. She didn't reject it out of pride, nor did she play the martyr to try and make them stay. She simply looked at her son, her eyes shining with genuine pride. "That is a wonderful step, Vance," Evelyn said. "My door will always be unlocked for you on holidays and Sundays. But you both need a home of your own, a place where you are the ones holding the line." Their departure wasn't a bitter falling out. It was the necessary evolution of two young adults finally realizing that their mother was an independent person to be honored, not a safety net to be taken for granted. On a golden Sunday afternoon the following autumn, the coastal town was bathed in the warm amber glow of a late October sunset. Evelyn sat comfortably in her favorite wicker armchair on the front porch, her husband's brass telescope pointed out toward the distant lighthouse. On the small table beside her sat a steaming mug of Earl Grey and a small plate with a few pieces of buttered rye bread. Right at 5 o'clock, the familiar sound of Vance's truck echoed up the driveway. He and Nora climbed out carrying a woven basket overflowing with fresh apples they'd picked at an orchard inland. They walked up the wooden porch steps. This time, Vance didn't just push the front door open out of habit. He paused at the screen door and knocked 3 times, waiting. "Hey, Mom, we brought you some Honey Crisps from upstate." Vance smiled, standing a respectful distance back, waiting for an invitation. Evelyn looked up, her smile brighter and lighter than it had been in years. "Come on in, kids. The tea is perfectly steeped." They sat together on the porch, talking easily about the changing weather and the fishing boats coming back into the harbor. There was no underlying talk of deadlines, no unspoken assumptions, no invisible demands. At exactly 5:30, Evelyn stood up gently, brushing a few breadcrumbs off her sweater. "You two make yourselves at home on the porch," Evelyn said, wrapping a thick knit scarf around her neck. "I have to head down to the docks to help Mr. Atwood close up the shop and inventory a few old compasses that came in." Vance and Nora watched their mother walk down the steps, her stride easy and purposeful as she headed down the windy coastal road. They knew they no longer had a mother who was constantly on call to manage their chaos. Instead, they had something far better, a truly happy, independent mother who had taught them the greatest lesson about love, that it only survives when it is built on a foundation of respect and clear boundaries. Thank you for watching Quiet Revenge. While AI tools may assist parts of our workflow, every story is carefully selected, edited, and reviewed by our team. If you'd like to help us continue creating emotional family stories for this community, you can support the channel with the cost of a small coffee. Patreon, https://www.patreon.com/quietRevengeFamily. Ko-fi, https://ko-fi.com/thestoryfamily. PayPal, https://www.paypal.com/PayPal me/Kanhuangmin. Your kindness truly helps more than you know.